Okay, good afternoon to everyone joining us from Israel, and good morning to our viewers in the United States as well as in other areas. As we gather amid continued uncertainty in our region, our thoughts are with all those affected by the ongoing tensions, and we pray for peace and security for Israel and the entire Middle East. It is a great honor to welcome you to the inaugural Adam and Bernard Cherrick Memorial Lecture at Bar-Ilan University. This annual lecture series was generously endowed by Jordan and Lorraine Cherrick of St. Louis, Missouri, together with their daughter Rachel, whose commitment to Jewish learning and leadership continues a remarkable family legacy. Adam Cherrick of blessed memory passed away on the 1st of Tevet 1988, shortly before birth. Though his life was brief, his memory became a source of inspiration for his family, strengthening their faith and inspiring enduring acts of kindness, learning, and remembrance in his name. Bernard Cherrick, born in Dublin in 1914, made Aliyah in 1947 and became one of the most influential figures in Israel higher education. A gifted orator, dedicated Zionist, and visionary leader, he served as senior vice president of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem from 1948 until his passing in 1988. He is remembered for his extraordinary contribution to Israeli academia, his devotion to Jewish education, and his unwavering commitment to the State of Israel. Jordan Cherrick, a graduate of Yeshiva University and Boston University School of Law, is a distinguished attorney and devoted student of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, Zichrono Livracha. Lorraine Cherrick, a graduate of Yale University and an accomplished business executive, together with Rachel Cherrick, a graduate of Barnard College and Washington University, have continued the family's tradition of leadership, philanthropy, and dedication to Jewish values. Jordan Cherrick has explained that the family chose Bar-Ilan University as the home of this lecture series because of its internationally recognized excellence in Jewish studies and because it embodies Rabbi Soloveitchik's vision of the fruitful encounter between Torah and general knowledge. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Cherrick family and to the American Friends of Bar-Ilan University, whose generosity, partnership, and commitment to Jewish education and academic excellence have made this evening possible. Thanks go to the North America and UK desk at Bar-Ilan University as well. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Miriam Feldmann-Kaye, one of the leading contemporary scholars of modern Jewish thought and the intellectual legacy of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Dr. Feldmann-Kaye has written extensively on Rabbi Sacks's philosophy, exploring his contribution to ethics, religious leadership, covenantal thought, interfaith relations, and the challenges facing Jewish identity in the modern world. Her scholarship has played a significant role in introducing Rabbi Sacks's ideas to both academic and broader audiences. In addition to her scholarly publication, Dr. Feldmann-Kaye has developed and taught a widely attended online course dedicated to the thought of Rabbi Sacks, enabling participants from around the world to engage deeply with his teaching on responsibility, morality, leadership, and the future of Jewish life. Through her research, teaching, and public engagement, she has become one of the foremost interpreters of Rabbi Sacks's intellectual and spiritual legacy. The theme of this evening's lecture, The Burning Bush and the Ethical Discovery, Rabbi Sacks and Contemporary Jewish Thought, could hardly be more timely. At a moment when questions of moral responsibility, leadership, community, and Jewish identity have become increasingly urgent, Rabbi Sacks's voice continues to offer wisdom and inspiration to people across religious and cultural boundaries. It is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Miriam Feldmann-Kaye to deliver the inaugural Adam and Bernard Cherrick Memorial Lecture. Dr. Feldmann-Kaye, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Avioz. And I would like to just begin by thanking the Cherek family, who I'm so delighted and honored to have met through the opportunity of giving this lecture. And I look forward to continued scholarly relationship. And it's been a pleasure until now just to learn from the Cherek family more about their intellectual history, especially through Rabbi Soloveitchik and the rabbinic dynasty in London as well that we discovered. So thank you very much for this opportunity. The most important thing, of course, to state at the outset is that Israel again finds itself at war, and it's shocking how quickly things can change. This evening, or morning for many of you, we were meant to be in person on the Bar-Ilan University campus, and now people are in their shelters or in their homes. And of course, there is the possibility of a siren going off during this lecture. And what we have decided to do is that if one siren goes off, we will take a approximately 10-minute break and come back. If there's a second siren, then we will record the rest of the lecture, and further communication about this will be given by American Friends of Bar-Ilan University during the lecture and also afterwards. So we're going to get going because we don't know how long we have. And I'll also say how easy it is at times like this to cancel events. Through the 3 years that we've been through here, it has always been easier to, the idea of cancelling is always easier in a technical sense, but it has always been for me much more meaningful to hold classes. Our students at Bar-Ilan love to learn, they love to come together and go on this continue on the intellectual journey together, even when war is going on around us. So that is what I intend to do with you this evening. It's a different setup to what we had all envisaged and imagined. And of course, I'm sure you'll also be, you'll also understand that as I talk about these themes of, our moral reality and our fractured world, actually, it's all very, very relevant for what we're talking about today. And as in an earlier class that I gave today, a lot of issues connected to the war did arise, and I think it's also important not to be afraid of that, because again, that is the relevance of what we're teaching essentially, and the kind of meaningful dialogue that we strive to bring about at Bar-Ilan. So what I would like to do is to use the parable of the burning bush as one through which we can understand a contemporary ethics and philosophy of the Jewish world. There are many initial questions that arise. So at the outset, I'll say I've just actually signed a contract to publish a book on the burning bush and contemporary ethics and Jewish philosophy. So I've had a little bit of time to think in advance about the questions that would immediately arise. So firstly, if there's going to be, if we're going to talk about the burning bush as a main parable, why and how is there so much that can be said about such a short parable in the Tanakh? How is it that we can base entire ethical and philosophical new ideas and new theories around one particular parable? Secondly, surely the story of the burning bush is based upon Moses's very personal, solitary experience by himself, something he either sees or hallucinates of a bush, a blaze burning and not going out. So what significance should that have in a broader sense, if any? So we're now going to go on go out on an intellectual journey together, and we're going to try and understand how important the burning bush parable can be for us to understand things differently. Today's age, a lot of the argument is very much based upon and rooted in contemporary and modern continental philosophical movements, but this lecture is not going to be dealing with those movements, specifically phenomenology and specifically existentialism. We're going to kind of come away a bit from that terminology, and I'm going to try and explain things as clear as possible without using that terminology. But really, the whole argument is rooted in these different schools of thought of continental philosophy. So let us begin. So let us begin by revisiting the story of the burning bush. I've just included here a few of the psukim, a few of the verses before we launch into an interpretation. And I'll already say that all of the different interpretations we have at our disposal, philological, historical, etc., what is going to concern us primarily is a philosophical interpretation of the burning bush. Okay, so we'll have to kind of save some of our other thoughts of the story for another time, because we are focusing here on a philosophy. An angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? Take note of the places that I've highlighted here, which we're going to refer to as we go along. Okay, so you can see this idea of Moses turning aside, noticing a marvelous sight, hamar'eh hagadol, and then asking a question. Okay, really noticing something starkly different about the natural world, and asking why things are different and why things are happening in this way. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. He answered, here I am, hineni. Okay, here we have this famous biblical proclamation of readiness, of showing up, of being present. And he said, do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. I am, he said, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Okay, we're now going to skip a few verses just for the sake of time. Moses said to God, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say, what is his name? What should I say to them? And God said to Moses, Eheyeh asher eheyeh. Take note here that even in the Sepharia translation, there is no translation even attempted. He continued, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Eheyeh sent me to you. And God said further to Moses, thus shall you speak to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever, this my appellation for all eternity. So let's just keep in our minds the highlighted phrases here and take a moment to consider how profound this parable is in Jewish, Christian, monotheistic culture, as well as in multidisciplinary lenses. I mean, I'm sure in every department of the Faculty of Jewish Studies, we could learn a different aspect of this parable of the burning bush. And here I've put some of the main theological themes of interpretation. When I say theological, I'm talking about religious thought or religious philosophy. And often what is spoken about is the idea of oppression and persecution of the Israelites at the hand of the Egyptians, the idea of holiness, holy time and sacred space. And we're going to mention, we're going to touch on this theme as we go along, the idea of Moses taking off his sandals, the meaning of testimony. We are going to look at this. What does it mean to behold such an event? The ideas of revelation and presence of God, and the model of a personal revelation, which is often known to be the burning bush revelation for Moses, whereas the collective revelation is known as Mount Sinai, which is often the focus when discussing revelation in Jewish theological concepts. Hiddenness and concealment in the divine and human realms, translation and theology, and teleology and redemption. We're going to touch on some of these aspects, especially on the translation of the words eheyeh and the futuristic aspects of the promise become, for some philosophers, and especially, as we will see, for Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, my teacher, a critical part of the meaning of the burning bush. And we're going to understand why. The lecture is split into two main parts. The first part of the lecture is going to be about the idea of witnessing, of bearing witness, and what it means to be a witness. And the second half is going to be about translation and the ethical responsibility of interpretation. Okay, so we're going to start off with the idea of witnessing. And the first thing we're going to say about witnessing is that we're going to take note of one of Moses's first concerns straight after this individual revelation happens at the burning bush. Moses's first question is Ma Omar Alehem. What am I going to say to them? In other words, he has beheld the most incredible moment, the most wondrous and mysterious event, perhaps what everybody is looking for. And what concerns him is, are less the theological questions, let's say, but they are more, how am I going to relate this experience to those who are not here right now? In other words, what is my responsibility to the others? And I'm going to take this even further, and I'm going to say, what is incumbent upon me to do in light of this revelation? There's an immediate recognition that this personal revelation, this personal, solitary, beautiful experience of mystery is not enough by itself. It is accompanied by a turn outwards, a turn to others. And on this idea of witnessing, we're going to look briefly at a few different philosophers. We're going to look at Emmanuel Levinas, Abraham Joshua Heschel, followed by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And in part two, we're going to look at other philosophers. So we're going to try to understand firstly what Levinas can teach us about this idea of bearing witness. Okay, I know there are a lot of students on the call this evening, and we've studied Levinas in Bar-Ilan in our department. Levinas is very prominent, and I'm going to say a A couple of sentences for those who might not have heard of him. Emanuel Levinas was a Jewish philosopher of the 20th century who was born in 1905 and died in 1995. He lived the latter half of his life in French and was engaged in France and was engaged in French Jewish life, having lived his earlier life in Kaunas in Lithuania, having been a prisoner in a prisoner of war camp. And there is an entire biography, as there is with all of the philosophers we're going to mention this evening, that is worth learning about. And one of the main ideas that Levinas situated was the idea of otherness. The idea that often people will say it's about the other, and yes, there are others, but there is also an idea in philosophy of otherness, that things outside of me are, or beyond me, are other to myself. They are separate from me. And what's most important about this concept is my recognition that what I experience ends with me, with my persona, and with my experience. There's a boundary, there's a guard, and then there is the experience of the other. And the experience of the other I can never experience. I can never have access to. Not even of my spouse, of my child. There's always that gap. And for Levinas, who believed that ethics was the primary priority of philosophy after the Second World War, and in light of the horrors of the Shoah, he believed that it's so important to situate otherness in every decision we take and in every act that we do. And Levinas has a fascinating essay on the meaning of testimony, on the meaning of bearing witness. And we're going to read a short part of this, and we're going to apply it to the burning bush. In Ethics and Infinity, Levinas writes, "The witness testifies to what was said by himself. For he has said, 'Here I am,' before the other. And from the fact that before the other, he recognizes the responsibility which is incumbent on himself, he has manifested what the face of the other signified for him." Before we continue to the next sentence, we'll just pause and unpack this. What does it mean to bear witness? To bear witness is part of being in a relationship. And when we're in a relationship, we need to recognize the significance of the otherness, and we need to take responsibility for the implications that otherness has. And now let's think back to what we've just said about Moses and the burning bush as we read this final sentence. The glory of the infinite reveals itself through what it is capable of doing in the witness. What does this mean? This means that in the encounter of the burning bush, if we're giving a Levinasian interpretation of it, the true significance of the encounter at the burning bush is not the story so much of taking off the shoes and even the revelation of the divine, but it is what it's capable of doing in the witness. We're going to take this in the direction of what we will call self-transformation. Moses, according to Levinas, is expected to undergo self-transformation at that moment. And the transformation is expected to have implications. Ma omar alehem. What is he then going to do with it? Okay, what's he going to do with this experience? How is it going to change him? And how is that change going to be for the betterment of the people of Israel around him? So I see the burning bush moment very much as a Levinasian example because it represents it. Firstly, it presents the burning bush as an encounter that changes one. It's an encounter wherein the element of the unknown is hugely important, not in terms of the mystery, but what do we do when something is mysterious? What do we do when we don't know something? It's important for those who know more about Levinas's philosophy. It's important in terms of the meaning of the face, the hiding of the face, and the way that Levinas uses the idea of the face to mirror our responses as ethical beings. It's important because we get a sense of how Moses takes responsibility for this moment and what he feels is incumbent upon him, which is to ask, Ma Omar Alehem. And this is why we will call Moses the Levinasian protagonist, because at this stage in our philosophical discussion of the burning bush, we have a Moses who embodies, I think, what Levinas calls for, which is to see the world around us as an encounter, to see ourselves being in an encounter with an element of responsibility and with the potential in our mind always of self-transformation. So not just to walk away from an important moment and go back to what we were doing, but to ask, how is this meant to change the protagonist? So we're going to move a step further along in part one now, bringing Moses, our Levinasian protagonist, with us. And we're moving now to Abraham Joshua Heschel, also a Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, whose works are becoming more and more popular in Israel as more works become translated into Hebrew. Heschel was a phenomenologist. He spoke of the phenomenon of life and our encounter of the phenomenon. And we're going to look at what Heschel has to say about the burning bush. And you'll be pleased to know that his language is perhaps a little clearer than that of Levinas's. Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his work Israel, an Echo of Eternity, published very soon after the Six-Day War, writes as follows: Moses, tending to the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb. An angel appeared to him in a blaze of fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why is this bush not consumed? The amazement of Moses was, the bush was burning, yet the bush was not consumed. Now listen to what Heschel says. We too, walking in the wilderness, arrive at times at the mountain of God and see the whole world, a burning bush, aflame with hatred, envy, and murder, yet the world is not consumed. I'm overcome with tears at this moment reading it, with the state that we are in currently in the world and in Israel, and how pertinent it has always been and continues to be to consider ourselves as a people at the time, in the moment of the burning bush. The move that Heschel does as a phenomenologist is to place the reader in the shoes or sandals of Moses. Often in in I would say day-to-day or kind of the Jewish Shabbat life, reading Parashat Shavua, what has become quite popular these days are psychological interpretations of biblical figures. And what we see here is a philosophical interpretation of Moses, of the biblical figure. But what he's actually doing is he's saying that we, the reader, we must consider ourselves as those who arrive at times at the mountain of God and see the whole world. In other words, sometimes we might get a little bit of perspective on the terrible things that are going on in the world around us. Sometimes we might even be able to have the intuition of seeing a burning bush. We might even be able to understand the significance of this parable, a flame, hatred, envy, and murder. And we might even be able to say, and yet the world is not consumed, or, and yet we continue. So we're taking this model of Moses with us as well. Okay, Moses as a Heschelian phenomenologist, Heschel, who says that we too can stand at the burning bush. In other words, he's taking away the historical or textual and hermeneutical levels of a Jewish understanding of the burning bush, and he's saying, this is now. We are living the burning bush right now. That's phenomenology. Okay, the chronology of things, the history of things, they put to the side, and witnessing the world as a phenomenon, that's top priority. So we're now taking these two interpretations with us of Moses as a Levinasian protagonist, as we saw, and Moses as a Heschelian phenomenologist. We're taking these two aspects of Moses with us to our reading of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks was born in 1948 in London and passed away early in the year 2020. I'm not sure how much more I need to say by way of introduction. He was one of the greatest rabbinic thinkers and, I claim, philosophers of our times. And the idea of the burning bush was something that came up time and time again in his writings over the course of several decades. And it's been something that I've been really interested in tracing what he does with it and how he uses the burning bush as a parable for our times. Okay, and now we're going to look at, this is the first of the coupling of encounters that we're going to have with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks this evening. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writes in To Heal a Fractured World, my teacher, Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, taught me that this is how to understand the moment Moses first encountered God at the burning bush. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And now Rabbi Sacks asks, why was he afraid? Okay, he's asking this question of why he was afraid to look at the bush. You know, you might have thought if somebody was having a personal, direct revelation, that they might not be afraid. Rabbi Sacks is interested in this particular element of the story. In other words, what could be wrong or what could be dangerous with what Heschel had suggested of placing ourselves at the burning bush? Heschel says, remember that we're able to, we have the capacity to reach some perspective of the world, to understand ourselves as a burning bush, to understand the world as a burning bush. And Rabbi Sacks issues a caution about this. He says, if we were fully to understand God, he would have no choice but to be reconciled to the slavery and oppression of the world. From the vantage point of eternity, he would see, this is Moses would see that the bad and what the Israelites are going through in Egypt is a necessary stage on the journey to the good. He would understand God, but he would cease to be Moses, the fighter against injustice who intervened whenever he saw wrong being done. He was afraid that seeing heaven would desensitize him to earth, that coming close to infinity would mean losing his humanity. And he finishes, that is why God chose Moses and why he taught Abraham to pray. These are very, very deep ideas. And here, we're also discussing really the meaning of God and how we can talk about the idea of God in a world of injustice. And you can see even, very briefly here, a comparison of Abraham and Moses, and that's going to have to be for another lecture. But what we can see here is that he's quite cautious about what Heschel suggests, because what makes Moses who he is his humanity, is his ability to sense injustice. If there were no mystery and if there were no questions, then we would have a pure divine perspective on the world. And Rabbi Sacks, in certain senses, says, in a world like that, humanity would put their feet up because there wouldn't be anything to fight for. In the conflicted, fractured world of oppression of Egypt, the Israelites were living in, and the context in which the burning bush happened in a phenomenological way, it's important to retain in the human space of what it means to be Moses. This was not a time, as one might have thought, to understand all of the intricacies of the divine. And this means that when we describe Moses as a Levinasian, who says, this is going to be my moment of self-transformation, that is the Moses that Rabbi Sacks was talking about. Because that is the Moses who was willing to encounter the mystery. He had the courage for that mystery to change him, and was then able to transform the moment into a collective event that would eventually lead to the Exodus and the receiving of the Torah. So we take to this model of Rabbi Sacks of a Moses as conflicted. He's standing at the moment of the burning bush, not with a clarity on life, but rather he would understand both the elements of the good and the bad. And here, of course, it's, emotional talking in this way, and with the events going on in Israel now, would that we not want some greater understanding of the greater picture, which seems to be what Heschel describes. How we might ask Rabbi Sacks, can we possibly prefer the human perspective on things? And I think Rabbi Sacks would have answered us by saying that this is the role, of humanity. It's to take responsibility for the particular perspective that we have. Moses is seeking a meaning and humanity in a fractured world. That is the type of person that Rabbi Sacks sought to bring about, really, through his writings and his teachings. as engaged in the story and its manifestations. And at this juncture, it's very important to note the great closeness that Rabbi Sacks had with Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik was, in Rabbi Sacks's terms, one of the main thinkers who transformed Rabbi Sacks, who encouraged him to be a Jewish leader, essentially to become who he became. He retained a relationship with Rav Soloveitchik for many years. And I think, we could say that Rav Soloveitchik's strong existentialist tendencies of a thinker, Rav Soloveitchik, who was, as well as being a brilliant rabbinic figure, was able to integrate that type of thinking and with creative halachic thinking, and also with deep existentialist thinking about what is the purpose of humanity here today. And a brief look at the Lonely Man of Faith gives us a sense of that, and we can so easily kind of hear Rav Soloveitchik's voice when we read Rabbi Sacks. Our interim summary. What have we learned so far as we come to the end of part 1? The burning bush so far. Bearing witness, standing at the burning bush, must lead to self-transformation. Okay, for Levinas, the meaning of revelation is that it has to transform us. Something has to come of it. Secondly, we place ourselves within the phenomenon. This is Heschel, influenced by Edmund Husserl, the phenomenologist. Okay, as Heschel said, we ourselves standing at the burning bush, placing ourselves within the phenomenon. And thirdly, Moses is undergoing self-transformation at a moment of truth, berega ha'emet, and it's that will turn him into a collective leader. We now move to part 2. Part 2 is we're going to look at translation, okay? And the purpose of the move to translation, which we're going to look at through different philosophers, is the move from self-encounter, what does this encounter at the burning bush do, to what are the dialogues that it engenders with the collective, with those around Moses, with the Israelites, even with Pharaoh. Second, the move from phenomenology of the encounter in the world to ethical hermeneutics, or to the question, how do we interpret Bible ethically? How do we interpret events with an ethical head? And thirdly, the move from self-transformation to transmission, which is essentially what happens with all of this and already is paving the way to Mount Sinai. Okay, so now we're going to look at translation and the ethical responsibility of interpretation. So we move really from this idea of Moses standing at the bush and the idea of experience to the idea of translation. And you can immediately see here the words eheyeh asher eheyeh in front of you. And they cause what has been the discussion of philosophers and religious thinkers from all of the religious traditions of yore. In the study of religions in the 20th century, in the 19th and 20th centuries, Paul Ricoeur, a French hermeneutical thinker and a Christian thinker, discusses. I like the way he puts the challenge of the words eheyeh asher eheyeh. The alternative translations, he's talking about these words, eheyeh asher eheyeh, that have been proposed are in fact paraphrases and commentaries that restore the cultural, spiritual, and theological context of this verse. We'll just take a pause here. What's he saying? He's saying that people translate the words eheyeh asher eheyeh in whichever way suits them culturally, spiritually, theologically. In other words, they don't help us to understand perhaps what a true translation might be. And in this way, they make explicit what I call the gap in meaning produced by Exodus 3:14. Exodus 3:14 is, of course, the moment that we are talking about, and the words that I want to draw your attention to are the gap in meaning. And often when there's a gap in meaning, what do we try to do? We try to fill the gap. In all of the different departments in the Faculty of Jewish Studies, we are trying to fill this gap, okay? But this gap that Ricoeur describes has a different kind of meaning. A brief glance at Jewish philosophers in the modern period shows us how much they toyed with the idea of translating the words Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. Hermann Cohen, translating to the German, was against this translation of I am that I am. And he called for it to be translated as I am the being. I am the one who cannot be named other than by I am. And Hermann Cohen was reflecting the particular German Jewish reality that he lived within, the world that concerned him. And very much influenced by Hermann Cohen, who was, of course, influenced by Moses Mendelssohn's retranslation of the words Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. We have really a beautiful commentary by Martin Buber on the burning bush in his book Moses. Moses is told Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. Buber writes, this is usually understood to mean I am that I am. This could only be understood as an avoiding of the question, a statement which withholds any information. And here is the critique of the translation, I am that I am. And in a moment, we're going to see what the objection is to this and how Jewish the objection to this translation is. First, we're going to just look briefly at Martin Buber's own translation of these words in the Tanakh that he translated to German together with Franz Rosenzweig. They had a whole discussion about how to translate these words, which was published as an article in their joint work, Scripture and Translation. And I'm grateful to Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr for studying all of this with me. Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig are very concerned with understanding the burning bush as an encounter. They're not just trying to translate the words Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh as almost a translation exercise. They're thinking about the context, the narrative of the story, and what perhaps was meant to be being put across there. So they're trying to put across this idea of encounter, and also the idea of being in dialogue. Okay, so a kind of perhaps mirroring the voice, because in the parable, there's a question and answer session going on. Okay, what's your name? What am I meant to say to them? Okay, it's a dialogue. It's an encounter of dialogue, and in front of you, you can see some of the suggestions that Buber and Rosenzweig had, and they also changed their minds as they went along. I will be there as the one being there. Buber wrote, as the one who will always be there, so shall I be present in every time. Remember that these are translations they suggested for the words Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. It's almost humorous to think of this as a translation, because when we read translations, and what is the purpose of a translation? It's to help us understand the written word in our lingua franca, or in a language we might be able to understand. And you might say here that this is making it even harder to understand, and you would probably be right. I will be there as I will be there, is Franz Rosenzweig. Now, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks is following this all very, very closely. And he says that the resistance to a static interpretation of these words is critical, and it's not just about the translation of words. This is part of the meaning of the ethical experience of the burning bush altogether. And this is something that I'm working on and drawing from in my book and this evening as well. So there is a slightly long quote coming up by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, and it's really important that we're just going to take it slowly, and we're going to understand firstly how he agrees with Buber and Rosenzweig on the problematic Christian translations of the words Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh to I am that I am. Okay, and other, it's very interesting actually that Rabbi Sacks influenced certain Christian thinkers who then changed their minds on those translations, notably Professor Janet Soskis, who taught me at Cambridge, and others as well. So firstly, we're going to see his objection to the way it had been translated. We're going to see why changing the translation is important for him and what it should be changed to. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks calls the translation of Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh to I am that I am, he calls it the great mistranslation. And he discusses this several times throughout his life and spoke about it in public lectures, which you can watch online as well. Moses asks, "Who are you?" When the Israelites ask, "Who has sent you?" what should I say? God replies in a cryptic 3-word phrase, Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. It's fascinating, Rabbi Sacks says, to see how Christian Bibles translate this clause. The King James Version reads it as, I am that I am. Recent translations are variants of the same idea. Here are some examples. I am who I am what I am, that is who I am. And soon, in a moment, we're going to see that what he objects to is this word am, I am, the verb being. Rabbi Sacks continues, these are all mistranslations and the error is ancient. In Greek, Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh became ego eimi ho on, and in Latin, ego sum qui sum, I am he who is. Augustine in the Confessions writes, because he is with a capital I, that is to say, God is being itself. In other words, God is static. God's presence is static, remains the same, remains in the same place, remains tangible, understandable even. Centuries later, St. Thomas Aquinas explains that it means God is true being. That is being that is eternal, immutable, simple, self-sufficient, and the cause and principle of every creature. And so it continued in German philosophy, Rabbi Sacks, and he traces it through to the German Christian philosophers of modern times. God became Hegel's concrete universal, Schelling's transcendental ego, Gilson's God is being, and Heidegger's ontotheology. And before we move to the next part, let's just understand that what Rabbi Sacks is objecting to here is the idea that God's being is static, or that God has being in a static sense. And Rabbi Sacks is going to prefer the dynamism of a dialogue and an encounter and a personal experience and self-transformation. That is what he's going to prefer. Now, let's see how he puts it. Firstly, just to emphasize the radicality, really, of what Rabbi Sacks is saying, I've inserted in here just another comment from Paul Ricoeur, who's saying, I don't think that we can do this translation without the word being. Setting aside any thought about the polysemy of this verb, being, eheyeh, even when augmented by its Hebrew usage, I do not think so. ... It does not force us to eliminate it from our translation. Rabbi Sacks disagrees. Let's see how. It is as if God had said, my name is the future tense. If you seek to understand me, first you will have to understand the nature and significance of the future tense. The future tense, he's talking about the word eheyeh. I am that I am is a translation that owes everything to the philosophical tradition of ancient Greece and all of the philosophers he mentioned that we saw previously, and nothing to the thought of ancient Israel. The God of pure being, first cause, prime mover, necessary existence, these are big philosophical terms from the medieval period, is the God of the philosophers. In other words, Rabbi Sacks is saying this isn't the Jewish God. The God of I am that I am is not the Jewish God. This is a complete misunderstanding of the significance of the burning bush. Not of the God of the prophets, of the Hebrew prophets, he means. And then he asks, what then is the meaning of I will be what I will be, which is the translation that he chooses. And for anybody who has the new Sacks, Koren, Chumash, and Tanakh, you'll be able to see that this is indeed how he translated the words. I will be what I will be. The name itself never recurs in the Hebrew Bible, but there is a later echo in the great scene in which God appears to Moses on the mountain after the sin of the golden calf, in which he says, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. What this means is that God cannot be predicted or controlled. He cannot be confined to categories or known in advance. He is telling Moses, and if we're really trying to understand what's going on here at the burning bush, let's understand what Rabbi Sacks is telling us. He's telling Moses, you cannot know how I will appear until I appear, how I will act until I act. My mercy, my compassion, my strategic interventions into history cannot be controlled or foretold. I will be what, when, and how I choose to be. I am the God of the radically unknowable future, the God of surprises. You will know me when you see me, but not before. Now, what's so critical about this, and here Rabbi Sacks joins with Buber, Rosenzweig, and others, because he understands the burning bush as a parable of an encounter, of a theological encounter, and yet a theological encounter that makes demands on Moses, on the protagonist. And now we can begin to connect this whole idea of part 2 of translation to part 1. In part 1, we looked at the idea of witnessing and the self, placing the self in the moment of the burning bush. We saw that through Levinas and taking the moment of self-transformation and turning it into a collective moment. Through Heschel, by the idea of placing ourselves in the burning bush. And also of the way Rabbi Sacks issued a caution there and said, actually, Moses is a conflicted individual who was doing what he had to do, who faced the challenges that every leader faces, and yet took responsibility for the moment that happened to him in a solitary moment. And we take all of that with us to part 2 when we discussed translation. And what we can actually do now is we can maybe understand ourselves as standing at the burning bush, imagining the burning bush as the parable itself. We stand at the parable of the burning bush. We come to a lecture about the parable of the burning bush. And what do we do with it? And for Rabbi Sacks, what we do with it, the way we interpret the sacred text is critical to what will happen afterwards. He agrees with Levinas that an ethical interpretation of religious texts is paramount. We know that from his work, from his 2015 work in God's Name and the challenges of religious fundamentalism. And the ethical interpretation of sacred texts is critical. And so for here, we can connect what Rabbi Sacks said with Levinas, with Heschel, who's saying, well, put yourself there. Place yourself in that scenario. And then you will see how it transforms you. And so the words eheyeh, asher eheyeh, which in a way, they kind of postpone the problem or postpone the question, because Moses is not given an answer there or then as to the being of God, because there is no such easy answer. There are no easy answers. And yet, even with this, Rabbi Sacks manages to give a meaning to human life rooted in Rabbi Soloveitchik's thought, whose core is responsibility, and with this we'll end. The main idea in common between parts 1 and parts 2 is the idea of responsibility, what it means to bear witness, what it means to experience something difficult or mysterious, or to go through something, or to be party to an event. What responsibility should we take? What does that moment thrust upon us? And secondly, the responsibility of the interpreter, of the commentator. What do we then do with that moment? How do we interpret the encounter? How do we interpret the words? And how do we interpret what stands before us? To conclude, what we've learned about through these two aspects of the burning bush are the significance of responsibility through encounter rather than through a solitary experience. The idea of Moses standing at the burning bush as a model of an encounter with ethical ramifications. This whole story that we've told this evening reflects the 20th century shift from phenomenology to ethical and hermeneutical philosophical movements. That was a note for my students. A change, a shift in the self. How is the self constituted through the encounter with the other? That's our encounter with the sacred text. That's Moses with the Israelites, with Pharaoh, etc., etc. Only through a turn to the collective does the self have true meaning. That's essentially the way that Sacks takes it. Only through responsibility of bearing witness, and secondly, translation, can a contemporary ethics of the burning bush be achieved? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam, for a fascinating lecture, an excellent and inspiring presentation. We look forward for reading your materials in the book that will be published. And also I invite everybody to join her massive online course, which now has something like more 85,000 participants. A very, very important course. I really invite you. I would also like to thank the Charek family for the endowment, for all this partnership with them, and also the AFBIU, and to you in Missouri and in Israel for joining us, for your patience. Thank you very much.